It's fantastic to see so many people united, and as I said yesterday, the tourists are gone and the real projects start. And you see that without tourists, it's even a lot of people who are there. We could yesterday see the vibe of real projects. If I can take one example of the few projects that have been announced in the last days or will be announced in a few days, let me come to Belgium later, because we are not only hosted by Belgium, we have a Belgian minister here, JEAN-LUC CRUCKE. But let me start by Spain. In Spain, we will see until the end of the year announcements. Some of them have been done already, some will come. Around 750, 800 megawatt FID. That's super concrete. Would you have told me 5 years ago that this concreteness will happen in a country like Spain? I would have said, well, let's see, I don't believe it. But it's very, very concrete. And this is something that happens also based on the partnerships that exist here in the room, here in our community, in the hydrogen sector. All of these projects are projects where many, many companies, also many countries work together. And this is why these meetings are so important. And this is why you never know how it goes. But I have to say yesterday was a fantastic start. And I'm absolutely sure we will continue today in the same very positive, very pragmatic spirit. You have seen on our screen here the sponsors. This conference lives because there are sponsors who say, I want this to happen. You see how important it is that it happens, so thanks very much. Merci beaucoup to all the sponsors. I think it was super, super important to do this, even without an exhibition. Mr. CRUCKE, I come to you in a second, but normally 3 years we organized at the Atomium, at the exhibition center, quite a big exhibition, which is also economically for Belgium not a bad thing. We have been awarded as Brussels ambassadors also as Hydrogen Europe. So we do it next year again, and I can announce already the date, 26th to 30th of October 2026, big exhibition again in close to the Atomium. Although many people told us, we like the nice atmosphere here. So we got a lot of feedback that the atmosphere without exhibition, being in a conference center where you are closer together, was also very attractive. We will think about that. We will ask you and think about that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's come to our first speaker, the Belgian minister basically for the transition in climate, energy, and also in transport. Belgium is not only host country here, Belgium is, like Europe, on a smaller place, also for hydrogen. We see a lot of hydrogen projects here. Belgium has the biggest port with responsibility for ammonia. So ammonia, the center of ammonia in Europe is in Antwerp. And this is a very, very important issue for us as hydrogen sector, because ammonia is one of the main carriers for imports. That's why it's not a surprise that Belgium was the first country to issue an import strategy for hydrogen. So very much behind it. And it is an issue. We need to decide whether we want to import hydrogen or whether we want to produce it here. It has been discussed also by the board of directors of Hydrogen Europe strategically. And of course we need both, but we need to not favor imports on the detriment of local domestic production. And there are possibilities to do it, and we are on it. Belgium also was somehow a very sympathetic country when it comes to hydrogen, because we had an interesting government before. I will talk about your predecessor, Tine van der Straten. You know her very well, and you talked to her, and you had a briefing. And Tine is interesting because it also shows what is good and bad in the hydrogen sector. Tine is green. She belongs to the Green Party. She was an activist against nuclear. very strong, very, very, very strong. But when she then became a minister, she became much more pragmatic. So all the green issues, the targets, were basically translated into concrete pragmatic action. Honestly, it took some while. It was not immediately. So we are all humans. It took some while. But she was super pragmatic in the end. And Belgium became one of the leading countries in the Council. You know, our European system is very complicated. We have the European parliamentarians. That's first chamber. You saw some of them yesterday. And we have the second, possibly also the more important chamber, I don't know, with the member states, where the member states do their input. We need member states to support our cause, or other member states who show support, but sometimes to jeopardize. That also exists. Belgium has always been a strong supporter, despite any political color. And this is why I would like to announce also your way, because Jean-Luc CRUCKE was in a party I know very well. I was in my previous life also a representative or political representative in the same political group, liberal, but you left it. Because you became super pragmatic, down to earth, you wanted to do things. And this is exactly the spirit that we need right now. We have seen a lot of ideologies here. We talked yesterday a lot about Timmermans. I can tell you that in the evening, some former collaborators of Timmermans came to me, saying, we are a little bit sorry that we did overarching targets for hydrogen that harm you now, because everybody says you cannot match the expectation. It was driven by some ideological ideas, of course. So we have to live with that. A hydrogen sector like we are, we have to live with politicians who come with good ideas, out of ideology, bad ideas out of ideology. We have the same, also bad. But this is not how the world in the end works, how technologies work. Technologies need a long-term expectability. That's why Oman is so important. Oman is a country. You had a meeting, Minister CRUCKE, with your Omani counterpart, whom we had yesterday here on stage. Fantastic. That's a country that shows how to safeguard long-term investments. This is what we need. We need to have a clear set of rules, possibly not too dense, but then to know they exist for a long time, because investors need exactly that predictability. And that leads me to you, Jean-Luc CRUCKE. You're from the Walloon region, which is an industrial region. Ladies and gentlemen, the center of the world trade was in Antwerp, was only 200 years ago here in Belgium. And you can see, and I remember Bart de Wever when he addressed in Antwerp the launch of the Clean Industrial Deal, Ursula von der Leyen and Bart de Wever. He asked her, please, 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 be pragmatic. Don't do overarching goals. And get us back into what we were before we were a trading continent, Antwerp as a center of the global trade, but let's not be the museum of industry. That's super important for us Europeans. I was born in Duisburg, which is not far away from here, and Duisburg was always connected to Port of Antwerp. Very much so, because it's the biggest inner port of the world, basically. It's not only in Europe. So we know how important these industrial ties were, and we need to have a future of these industries. We cannot just say, okay, we close them down. But that's the spirit in some areas, unfortunately. And hydrogen is a technology, a basic technology, that can turn old jobs, coal-based jobs, into new jobs. Not only in Oman, not only like our Commissioner Suica said yesterday in the other part of the Mediterranean, but also in Europe, also in Wallonie, also in Belgium, also here. This is why it's with great pleasure that I would now invite Jean-Luc CRUCKE on stage as the representative of not only the host country, but one of the hydrogen countries in Europe, Jean-Luc CRUCKE, Minister of Belgium. Welcome to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, first also a few words for the moderator. Thank you so much for your lovely words about Belgium and your lovely words about my colleagues and friends, Tine van der Straat. Ladies and gentlemen, we are together here today to address a crucial issue for the energy and climate future of our country. The role of renewable hydrogen in decarbonizing our economies, particularly in sectors where alternatives are not available or are not sustainable on the long term. As we know, the European Union and Belgium have committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. The transposition of the Renewable Energy Directive sets clear targets: increase the share of clean energy, develop renewable fuels, and drastically reduce emissions. But some parts of our economy cannot be easily decarbonized. Heavy industry, such as steel, chemicals, or cement, requires extremely high temperatures and specific processes. In transport, particularly maritime, aviation, and long-distance trucking, electrification is not easily deemed an appropriate option. This is where renewable hydrogen and its derivatives, such as ammonia, methanol, or synthetic fuels, become essential to complement and why not replace partly biofuels. These fuels are particularly relevant for transport, which is responsible for a significant share of our CO2 emissions, while some segments are hard to decarbonize. Why renewable hydrogen? Renewable hydrogen produced with renewable electricity from solar, wind, or other sources offers several advantages, such as being a feedstock, a fuel, or an energy carrier, enabling energy storage, offering several derivatives. Hydrogen and its derivatives are not yet a universal solution, but are a key building block in the energy transition, although their cost can still be an obstacle. For Belgium, for Europe, producing renewable hydrogen domestically is essential. That means harnessing of offshore wind capacity, solar power, and grid interconnections. But our domestic resources, at least in Belgium, will remain limited. We expect the demand for clean and competitive fuels to rise rapidly. This is why imports become essential. With all ports, notably Antwerp and Zeebrugge, Belgium can become an European hub for hydrogen and its derivatives. By positioning ourselves now, we can secure reliable and competitively priced access to these new fuels, while strengthening our strategic role within Europe. But to succeed, we must act now, by developing adapted terminals, putting in place a clear regulatory framework, and ensuring the sustainability of these fuels. This is a collective challenge, but also a tremendous industrial and climate opportunity. Competitive and sustainable hydrogen cannot emerge without proper infrastructure, which includes port terminals, transport, and distribution networks interconnected with our neighbors and industrial facilities ready to adapt their processes. The development of renewable hydrogen also depends on a clear and stable framework. Investors need visibility, companies need transparent rules, and citizens need guarantees on the long term. We need defining robust sustainability standards for renewable fuels, prevent greenwashing, and possibly setting up transitional support mechanisms. We must create a hydrogen market that is transparent, competitive, and aligned with our climate goals. This requires European cooperation to push strengths and harmonize rules and price signals that favor low-carbon competitive solutions, while supporting vulnerable sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond climate concerns, renewable hydrogen is a major industrial opportunity. By developing a local value chain, we can create new skilled jobs, attract investments, and strengthen industrial competitiveness. Renewable hydrogen is not an option, but a necessity if we are to meet our climate objectives. It is a solution tailored to electrify sectors, a vector of energy security, and an economic opportunity for our country. Belgium must invest in its own production, but also embrace import, develop infrastructure, build a solid regulatory framework, and ensure a transparent and sustainable market. Thank you for your attention.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. I think it's impressive to see that we have you on our side, because it's good for Belgium. What happens for hydrogen is good for Belgium. Give you one simple example. BASF, biggest chemical company in the world, after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, had a problem with supply from natural gas, which is basically used as a feedstock for ammonia. I visited the chairperson of BASF at that time, Mr. Brudermüller, because BASF has in the port of Antwerp huge capacities. And my plea was, please, why don't we reorientate the jobs that you might close down in Ludwigshafen in Germany and bring them to Antwerp to keep them in Europe? Maybe you know the decision of BASF. The jobs are now in China because it's easier. He's also married to a Chinese. He's not CEO there anymore. And she lives there now. But this is not the way it should be. And we want that in a European corporation, these things don't happen anymore. I can tell you that, knowing Germany quite well, that BASF got a lot of money after the Second World War to be established in Germany. So for me, honestly, I'm very honest to you now, it's also an act of patriotism to stay in Europe. But we need to invite them. We cannot let them go. And this is what leads me now to our next speaker, JOAQUÍN Rodriguez, who, CHATZIMARKAKIS, Spanish guys have always many names, Greek guys have long names. You are in a special country and you serve a special company. And it's for us an honor to have you here. Moeve, that you will represent here, was CEPSA before. And it's one of those companies with this spirit, yes, we are oil and gas, but we believe in this transition. We believe in the possibility to turn the possibilities that your country has. You have vast spaces also for renewable production into molecules. And this is especially important because JOAQUÍN worked for Endesa many years, and that's the electricity guys. It's the electricity guys that some months ago let go the blackout in Spain. You remember. We can discuss politically. Why did it happen? Why did it not happen? We can discuss. In the end, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 12 gigawatt of too much of supply that could not be handled by the system. System broke down, and then it took some while, no inertia, it took some while to bring it back again. Problem. Can I say one thing? 12 gigawatt caused a blackout for nearly 2 days in the Iberian Peninsula. 100 gigawatt in Europe are under control of Chinese providers, out of which 70 gigawatt remotely can be stopped. You can check it. 70. This is the danger in which we live. Spain, I don't know whether China played a role, maybe not. I don't want to say that. What I want to say is you can see what you can cause with some gigawatt. And if you remotely control them, I showed you yesterday the nice picture of gentleman here addressing the world, Xi Jinping, in a new way. It's a danger. This is why to go into a redundant system, into more infrastructures to help a system be resilient is the Spanish way. And I'm very happy that JOAQUÍN, as the connoisseur, the guy who knows this very, very well, will now address us. JOAQUÍN, please take the floor for Moeve.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, JORGO. Thank you, Hydrogen Europe, for organizing this great conference. I like what you said about that the tourists are gone, and now we are here to make this happen. And I was supposed to introduce myself and Moeve, but I think it's not necessary anymore. But I will say something about my past, let's say, professional experience in Endesa. I used to work there for almost 30 years. And I was there in the late, let's say, years of the 20th century, when coal was the basis of the Spanish electricity production. And I had a CEO there then, when the first windmills were built in Gibraltar, well, in Tarifa, nearby the Strait of Gibraltar. And he said, well, those fancy toys will never replace coal in Spain. I mean, we cannot rely on the security of supply and competitiveness on things that are not predictable and are so expensive, and difficult to manage. 20 years afterwards, there are no coal plants in Spain anymore. And you know that almost 70% of the electricity generated in Spain comes out of these fancy toys. So if we look into the next 20 years, I am a strong believer that hydrogen will have a very relevant role. It will not be the only solution. It will be part of the solution to preserve what we want in Europe, which is energy independency. We need to be sure that we have the ability to continue our economies without relying on countries that are not necessarily our allies, to preserve competitiveness, and this is what I will talk about later, how to make this a solution for the industry to remain competitive in the long term, and then, of course, reduce the CO2 emissions, which is key to keep the planet alive. So, about Moeve, we are an energy company. We have a global footprint. We are not only a Spanish company. We have presence in many, many continents. From China, we have a chemical plant there, Canada, Brazil, and of course, Spain, Portugal, and Northern Africa. But we have embraced completely the energy transition. And we are here to accelerate and produce e-fuels, biofuels, any sort of very low carbon fuels that can help heavy transportation and industry accelerate the decarbonization. So let me see how to go to the next slide. Up. So just a reminder of the set of rules that in Europe motivate us to go into, let's say, using e-fuels. We have, of course, the ETS. This is the umbrella, which is not here. So everyone that is emitting CO2 is paying. And this includes more and more sectors like aviation now and maritime. And this is something that will decrease gradually the free allowances and increase, obviously, the price of these emissions. And there is a way to protect the European industry, it's called CBAM, from imports from third countries. But then there are specific obligations related to the use of hydrogen or RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. We have the RED III, which is now being transposed in many countries. There was a suggested minimum use of 1% of RFNBOs. I point out the case of Spain, which is now proposing 4%, so a lot more, and it's under discussion, but many other countries are also suggesting percentages higher than 1%. This is good. This is an obligation. There are not yet penalties defined, but there are suggested penalties that will be very strong, so this motivates even further, But then we have another two sets of obligations related to aviation, We have refuel aviation, where there are minimum percentages of blending with the jet fuel, increasing percentages of SAF and eSAF, no? the RFNBO version, with also attached penalties. And on the maritime, we have a Fuel EU Maritime, where there are also incentives like multipliers, and we have now IMO, maybe approving a framework with specific incentives to promote the very low carbon fuels. So all this is very good because there are obligations and there are penalties. So this makes the market move and creates a demand. Again, I got back 1 second. Okay. And this has its own, let's say, merit, because this set of rules are mostly pointing to those sectors where there are concentrated CO2 emissions, so you can abate substantial CO2 emissions at once, but also these are the sectors where the impact on final prices for the consumers is almost negligible. So we made here some examples on what is the impact of a t-shirt, of a cell phone, a pair of sneakers, when you bring them on a big container ship from wherever they are produced, using different percentages of e-fuels. We talk about 3% of e-fuels. The impact is nothing, it's less than 0.01% in the price of the t-shirt sold in the high street in any city in Europe. If we talk about 100% e-fuels, so a ship fueled by 100% ammonia, the impact is still negligible. So it looks the same because there are many zeros before the one is a rounded number. But this is the same for cell phones, same thing for sneakers. Of course, if you have bigger, let's say, items, then the impact is a little bit higher because you carry less items per container ship. But if we look about road transportation, and this is the edge of hydrogen when we compete or not with electricity, with direct electrification, still the impact is negligible. So this is why this is so obvious, And there is very few risk that there is delocalization of the transportation. This is, by definition, bringing goods to the market. So airplanes will fly into Europe, and food will be transported, and all these goods. So that's good, because these sectors become like tractors of the entire system. We can concentrate, let's say, the first big hydrogen projects in those locations where you can produce easily, these e-fuels. At the same time, these locations are typically industrial clusters, so other industrials can benefit being nearby, but this could be the starting points of an infrastructure that can connect those clusters and create, let's say, a market out of this. I also put the example of aviation, because it's relevant. We are discussing now about the targets, and maybe there is a reopening of these targets in 2027. By the way, I also heard during this conference that there are thinkings about the rules around the RFNBOs, and this is good. It's good to think what went well and what should be corrected, but I would suggest that this thinking is made very fast, because this creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the worst for investors. If this takes another 3 years, rethinking the rules, then everything will stop. But let me go into the competitiveness of producing hydrogen, because for transportation, as I say, this is perhaps easier. But if we think about industry, this is less obvious, because industry is competing in a global market, particularly that industry that needs hydrogen for high temperature processes. So we think that we should concentrate on how to reduce the cost of producing hydrogen. And if we look at the, let's say, breakdown of these costs, we have around 30% is the CAPEX, the equipment, and another 70% is the OPEX, which is basically electricity and all the related items. So transportation costs, balancing costs, things like that. So we are now looking a lot into the CAPEX and the subsidies for the CAPEX, but I would like to talk about the other part, which is the most relevant, which is electricity and related costs. And the other element is the load factor. and I don't talk about the intermittency, the hourly correlation that creates a lot of problems for hydrogen being produced in a way that is compatible with industrial needs. It's also about using the electrolyzer as much as possible to lower the levelized cost of the hydrogen produced. But in any case, whatever we do to make the hydrogen more competitive, it's important that if we set obligations for the industry, like for the transportation, there is like a CBAM for those obligations, so a protection from products being produced in other countries with no such obligations. For instance, we talk about maybe steel or ammonia. If there is an obligation in Europe to use green hydrogen for green steel, there should be a way to pass through this obligation to the final consumer. Maybe the impact is not as low as in transportation, but in a car, the weight of the hydrogen used in the green steel is, again, not so big. So there could be like fiscal incentives or ways to label the carbon footprint of those final products. Same thing for food, using green fertilizers, to protect, let's say, those who produce these products with hydrogen from imports from third countries where there are no such obligations. But again, regardless of this, I would like to talk about the electricity sector, which is the one I know better, because, of course, we have put a number of, let's say, targets and obligations, and we have made very, very strict rules regarding additionality and hourly correlation, but these have not been synchronized with the grid development, with the grid cost allocation, how the tariffs are being set, and with other measures that could be easily rethink without major changes in the general rules of RFMBOs. And I talk about grid charges, of course, so applying ex ante a reduced tariff like electro-intensives, because electrolyzers by definition are electro-intensive, so they should have similar tariffs like steel, cement, or other electro-intensive industries. But moreover, to help the production of hydrogen by eliminating the balancing costs, which are very relevant. In every country, as you introduce more and more renewables, which are intermittent, there is need for more balancing power, and this is spread out in the tariffs to all the customers. But electrolyzers are not like any other customer, because electrolyzers are flexible, need to correlate hourly with the intermittent renewables. So they could easily absorb this intermittency. So why should they pay for the balancing cost? And this is a huge component of the transmission tariffs. But we also think that in allocating, let's say, the new developments, because new renewables are necessary to comply with the additionality, there should be a priority in allocating the grid connection capacity to the electrolyzers because of this same additionality requirement. How can this be organized in a proper way? By asking, let's say, the renewable developer to sign long-term PPAs with electrolyzers, also with other industries, but as a prerequisite to access the grid. So decoupling the electricity market, the spot electricity market, which is very volatile and sometimes very expensive, from the very long-term, let's say, electricity market. So this is in line with the electricity market reform, and this would give certainty, because today, when we are developing a hydrogen project, we rely on renewables, which are additional, that need to go through permitting, but also to get the grid connection. And if there is no priority and a synchronization of both, there is a lot of uncertainty that cannot be coped. And of course, we are lucky in Spain because there is a lot of renewables, but in many countries, this becomes an impossible task. And finally, we think that there are other measures that could be set, like storage batteries, that under the current rules, they are required to be either in the electrolyzer, let's say, site or in the renewable site. We think that they should be anywhere in the system, most probably where there are bottlenecks, and they should be allowed to be used to store whatever renewable power is in excess when you manage several PPAs, and then used for the electrolyzer production. And finally, to allow for the self-consumption to be treated in a way that allows remote self-consumption. This is already allowed in many countries. In Spain, we have now a limitation of 5 kilometers. What we say is that self-consumption should be allowed without paying grid charges when there are no bottlenecks in the grid, because the electrolyzer will always follow the load curve of the renewables attached. And this is to show what would be the impact of all these measures. No? We have, this is the example of Spain, we have more or less a levelized cost, and this is a public number that is being published, around €6 per kilogram. If we give a subsidy of around 30% of the capex of the project, yes, there is a reduction of the levelized cost of hydrogen, but it's merely a 5% reduction. When you adjust the grid charges by reducing them, especially the balancing cost, the impact is huge. And this doesn't mean that the system will have a deficit, because this is incremental demand. The system has a cost. There is incremental demand to support with revenues the system. By reducing and adjusting, you can help the electrolyzer competitiveness by almost 20%, so 4 times a direct capex subsidy. And then finally, the grid priority access with PPAs and priority dispatch. This is also important because there is a lot of curtailment that is asymmetric. No? We have the obligation to follow the load curve on an hourly basis. So if there is a curtailment of the renewables, this affects immediately the production of hydrogen, but does not affect other sectors where they don't have this hourly correlation. This would have another 10% access, basically because we detach the cost of the electricity from the spot markets. We can then discuss PPAs on a levelized cost of electricity, which is the levelized cost of the combination of wind and solar. So we could achieve easily in the short term a levelized cost of around €4 per kilogram, which is very close to the grey hydrogen cost. Grey hydrogen is made up of natural gas, of course, and the CO2 emissions that we have to pay. But it's very volatile because CO2 emissions could rise, but natural gas, of course, is very volatile. With green hydrogen, what we have is stability. And of course, this is just the beginning. As we gain scale, as we improve the efficiency of the electrolyzers, this would lower even further the cost of the hydrogen. And all this is what we think will unlock big FIDs. This will attract investment into Europe. This will develop the entire value chain, so making sure that electrolyzers and the entire value chain is made in Europe, that we can create quality employment, because this will help decarbonize this heavy industry that could be delocalized and make them sustainable. And this ensures energy independence. So it's not a set of measures to favor one specific sector. This is a benefit for everyone. No? Promoting long-term contracts also avoids speculation. We had a very sad case in Spain of a lot of small developers just blocking interconnection capacity to resell it at a premium, so making electricity more expensive, and at the same time not allowing developing the projects with the certainty of that connection. Supporting energy storage, we think this is a must to continue developing renewables and decarbonize the grids, and reducing the curtailment, because electrolyzers are here to provide flexibility to the system. Basically, with all this, once we have big projects and then we start this rolling, we can then plan for the big infrastructures connecting those big clusters, so hydrogen pipes that will allow further expansion of the system. So this is how we see an orderly development of such a big opportunity like hydrogen. So thank you very much, and see you later.